Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
Hi, welcome to Point of View, the Millennial Roundtable. I am your host today, Chelsey Youman, and I am so excited for the show we have lined up today. It is that last week before Election Day, last week of early voting. So, of course, we are going to talk the election. But there are some other issues we'll have in the mix. With me today, I've got a stellar lineup. This first hour is going to be Jonathan Teague. He is the minister to married adults at Prestonwood Baptist Church up in the Plano area. Welcome, Jonathan.
Great to be with you, Chelsey.
So glad to have you.
Awesome conversation today, for sure.
I know. We're already ready to go. I can't wait. I cannot wait. And we also have on the line, we have Rachel Redus. She is on the campaign staff for Senator Ted Cruz, our Texas state senator. So welcome, Rachel. Thank you for joining us.
Yes, ma'am. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, we've got quite the lineup. This first hour, we're going to be talking about Texas and are we really turning blue? Are we not? We don't really know, but we can have our predictions. Certainly, voter turnout is an important issue to discuss right now. And maybe some of the more heated, close races that if you're not aware of, I would love to make you aware of for your local House guys, your local guys. They're really important to vote for issues you care about. And then we're going to talk about a debate that has gone on nationally, but is really growing in scale right before the election. And that is the moral obligation to vote and for whom. We have faith leaders, political pundits. Everyone is weighing in on this for the community of faith, for Christians. What should we do as Christians? What does the Bible tell us about that? And then what issues should we really be weighing and the importance of that? So we're looking at all of those this first hour. First, we're going to turn to Texas politics. I mean, no one in the country is ignoring Texas right now. We have made the New York Times, the Washington Post. Everybody is saying Texas is turning blue. And as a background, it is true that in the last election cycle in 2018, which would be midterms for your federal guys, but for our state House, we lost 12 seats. And that's really significant because, you know, we had a 21 seat lead. We lost 12. If we lose 9 more, if we lose less than we lost last time, we will lose our House. So that's really, really important. That means our House will go to the Democrats. And essentially, the Republican trifecta, we have the Republican House, Republican Senate, and Republican governor, has been this case for over 25 years in our state. So we will have a sea change that we haven't seen in decades at the state level. The significance of that is pretty obvious for most everybody, but that would include the ability to pass any legislation relating to limiting your taxes. Any pro-life legislation would be a stalemate for the first time in 3 decades. A lot of the strides on our social conservative issues that we have pushed for in the last 3 decades would be at least stopped, if not in danger of being repealed. And that's at the constitutional level as well. If you care about marriage, what the Bible has to say about traditional marriage or gender roles, any of that, will really be on the line when you look at the Democrat Party platforms. So I'd like to start there. Jonathan, I'm sure you've seen the news. What are your thoughts on this election cycle and what you're seeing in Texas?
Man, so first of all, we're going to have an election Tuesday. How about that? 2020 is not going to let us down on that one. And it's certainly shaping up on the national level, as you know, to be arguably one of the most significant in decades upon decades. And then obviously it's trickling down into the state level as well. And obviously that's, defer to you and Rachel for the expertise on that on the ground. But And from broad strokes, it's interesting, just the article we were, talking about today, and, the TCU professor that alluded to the fact that Texas is diverse and complex. It's a bit of an understatement. But, is it turning blue? I don't know. And I think this seems to be like one of those elections where we're going to maybe learn some new things about the country's mood and mind, both on the local, regional, and national level. It's really interesting to see how many Texans have come out to vote already. And so I think one of the things that, especially if you're a young adult listening today, that you need to hear is definitely vote. Not voting it really ought to be a non-starter for us at this point. Certainly just for us in general, but certainly for believers. I think we absolutely should be engaged and absolutely should be voting. My sister lives in New York City. She waited like 8 hours the other day.
Wow.
In line. Like it was so long. They were showing movies in Central Park to keep people
good for them. I mean, that's democracy at its finest.
1,000%. Yeah.
Yeah. Rachel, I believe you're in Houston. What are you seeing in your area over there?
I'm actually seeing, Houston is blue. Like, most people can look at Houston and Harris County and say, it's pretty blue over here. But I'm seeing, lots of diversity. We've had like 46%, I think, of Texans, somewhere around there, have already voted. And we're still in early voting, which is awesome.
Wow.
Like that article that we were emailing about was talking about, the huge percent of voters that have already gotten out and voted. And we're at, we have like 1.8 million more registered voters in Texas than we did in 2016. So that's awesome. And people are motivated, and it's for better or for worse, they're motivated on both sides. And I'm so glad to see people, pumped and excited about the presidential election. That's awesome. It's great. But I think something to keep in mind is definitely going down the ballot, all the way down the ballot. The city races, those are going to affect your daily life, more than, I hate to say it, but more than the president is going to affect your daily life. So I think something that we should be focused on is getting all the way down the ballot, like vote for the people who are going to represent your state, who are going to represent your school board, all the way down, and your judges for sure. So I don't think there's any doubt that there's leftists making headway in Texas. It's one of the most targeted states, like you were saying, we've been covered by the Washington Times or the Post, and everybody's talking about Texas. But I've gotten the opportunity to meet some really, really great Republican candidates. And I have faith that Texans who love our country and our liberties are going to show up to the polls in full force. So it's all up to our voters at this point. So if you're listening and you haven't voted, please get out and vote.
Yes, just get in your car, keep the radio on this station all the way to your polling site and go vote. Rachel, I love what you're saying. Let's give our audience a little bit of the numbers, because I want them to have a well-rounded picture of what's going on. More than 7.4 million people voted as of Sunday, and that's more than 80% of the total votes cast in 2016. So we're talking about people coming out in droves, highly motivated. And what does this mean for us? I mean, if you're on the left is making a lot of minority voters have signed up, and mobilization, anti-Trump. They're saying that, women in the suburbs will not vote for Trump. I mean, those are their arguments. But if you look at the Republican side of the ticket, they're saying, well, Republicans are really motivated. Once you read those Democrat Party platforms, see how extreme they truly are, where, that Republicans are motivated to get out and protect constitutional rights and the issues that are so beloved for them. The judicial system is on the ticket when you really think about what his nomination, his election will mean for the nomination process. So we are going to go to a break. When we get back, we're going to continue to talk about what's happening right now at the polls in the state of Texas. And then we'll continue on what Rachel was talking about, down ballot. What does that mean for you, your local officials, your state officials, who really have such a significant impact on your lives on the day-to-day? Who are some of those guys on the lower part of your ticket? So stay with us. We're going to get back into Texas politics here shortly after this break.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
One argument used to prove systemic racism is the extent of racial disparities. On the internet, you will find lots of charts that show differences between black and white that are used to prove racism. One way to respond to these charges is to look at one of the last columns ever written by black economist Thomas Sowell with the provocative title, Football and Fallacies. He talks about the reaction from some of the players in the NFL when a black punter took the field. One of the defenders cried out, "Fake." His reaction was understandable since you never see a black kicker in the NFL. Thomas Sowell put it this way: "I've seen hundreds of black players score touchdowns, but not one kick the point after. I've seen a black president of the United States before I've seen a black kicker in the NFL." Now, he's obviously questioning the assumption that statistical differences between racial groups indicate discrimination. But does that mean there is discrimination among kickers in professional football? Well, not at all. We all know the answer to that question. Owners and coaches will pick the best player regardless of their ethnic background. In fact, they might even take foreign players who can't even speak English if they can kick a football. The lesson here, of course, is that we have been told for decades that statistical differences are automatically a reason to suspect discrimination, whether between races or sexes. He even goes on to remind us that some of the differences in wages between men and women have more to do with different career choices. So let's be honest, some statistical differences do point to discrimination, either overt or subtle. But in most cases, the differences are due to other factors that have nothing to do with discrimination. That's the lesson we can learn from this football story. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Racism, go to viewpoints.info/racism. That's viewpoints.info/racism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Hi, welcome back. We are so happy to have you listening in to the Millennial Roundtable today, where we are going to discuss this election from a millennial perspective. There's so much to cover. We've been talking about early voting has been record-breaking in Texas. Texas is leading in early voting. It's the leading state right now. Voters are mobilized, which is a beautiful thing for democracy, of course. But we're here, pontificating essentially like, what does that mean for Texas? A few high points are that 7.2 million voters have already come out. We know that the suburbs have grown in the last few years, not just in terms of population growth, but in terms of outside population growth. So large corporations have moved their headquarters to Texas because Texas is good for business, great economy here, thanks to a lot would attribute to conservative economic principles. And that has brought business here. And with that business has come a lot of out-of-state transfers. So, we don't have a state income tax, generally low tax rates. All of that has contributed to a lot of people wanting to move to our great state to reap the benefits of what our beautiful state has to offer. With that comes, though, a diverse set of voters and a lot more Democrats voting. A few high points that I would really love for our audience to hear is that out-of-state dollars to Democrat candidates is at 12 million right now from just one super PAC. So out-of-state dollars have been flooding by literal millions into our state. Democrats have outraised Republicans $19 to 1. So that's really significant. And I think for our election, we're going to see, can Texans really be bought? Are we going to see a large shift from red to blue? And I certainly think if you're listening and you have conservative values and you're not outvoting, your state will be blue. That's the bottom line, right? We've got to get out and vote. We've got to, adhere to our principles. So we were talking, Rachel is on the line. She's with Senator Cruz's campaign, and she was telling us a little bit how important those down ballot races are. I mean, we know at the city level and county level, when you look at your commissions, they're the ones defunding the police departments, in charge of the police departments. They're the ones in charge of your more day-to-day activity, and then your local taxes, of course. And then at the state level, any legislation we pass in the state that really has ramifications for your day-to-day life, that's going to be your House district races, your state Republicans. No state senators are really on your ballot, so you're going to need to be looking for those. And if you want to know, hey, I don't have time to do a ton of research, but I just want to know who is my pro-life candidate on the ballot at the state level. Go to prolifetexans.com, Human Coalition Action, hucoaction.org. Those are election resources. That is the organization I work for. And we've gone ahead and just endorsed your pro-life candidates. If they have a pro-life voting record or responded to our pro-life survey in favorable ways, you will know who your pro-life candidate is. Go there, hucoaction.org/election resources to see those. But Rachel, what are you seeing on your ballot? I know you're in Harris County down there. Is there anything you want to add on the importance of voting down ballot?
No, you kind of covered it. I'll add on to it. I mean, we're talking about like property taxes, school system, the police, everything that affects you on a day-to-day basis is going to be affected by those people that we elect down ballot, which is going to be even down to your constables, your county clerk, justices, everything like that. I just want to reiterate the importance of voting all the way down. I've heard so many people, again, saying how excited they are about, President Trump, and I'm going to vote President Trump, and and that's great. And I'm glad that they're, doing that and voting for the president. But you can't forget about our down ballot candidates, because that's it's another important part of, our government. And so we have to keep our state house, and, we have to keep our state, for one. For two, then we have to go into the federal and keep, our Senate. And I mean, there's so many important aspects to voting, and it's not just the president. So I think you pretty much covered it. I'm just kind of reiterating what you said, but a down ballot, and people don't, for some reason, I don't think people really think of it as being important, but it is.
Absolutely.
So.
Jonathan, is there anything you want to add? I know that you're actually in a very highly contested district. You're in Collin County, currently Representative Leach's district. He was within, I think, 1,000 votes last time. Oh, wow. Matt Shaheen's also in Collin County as a state rep, and he won by 250 votes. Yeah. Not 250,000. 250 votes. Yeah. Morgan Meyer, Dallas County is a highly contested rate, also won by 200 votes last time. Yeah. And then I know Carrie Isaac is challenging a Democrat. If you're in Hayes or Bexar County, Carrie Isaac is challenging a Democrat down there, and that's contested race. In Denton County, we've got Kronda Thimish. So you've got quite a few Republicans right there in close races. Jonathan, what do you have to say about what you're seeing in your area?
Yeah, I mean, I think even just looking kind of to Rachel's point, I think it's incredibly profitable as Christians if we're going to really, embrace the worldview of the Scripture, that we've got to look at what is now pretty obviously clear contrast of the platforms that are at play. And when you really examine that up and down, I mean, we'll take Rachel's counsel to us here to think down ballot and not just think on the national level and say, well, the rest will take care of itself. That might have been true in Texas a couple decades ago, maybe even a decade ago. It's probably not now. I have family that live in California, Colorado, and you're seeing that exodus, as it were, kind of coming back. And Texas is a great place to live. It's a great place to do business. It's a great place to worship. It's a great place to raise a family, on and on and on. So it's not shocking that people want to come here. But I think it was even our great friend Matthew McConaughey, the living scholar that he's become, right? Who said the other day, come here to Texas, but don't come to change it. And so, I mean, that's Matthew McConaughey, right? So I thought that was fascinating, and I hope every college student in Austin is thinking about that as well, because there is you saw it in Judge Barrett's confirmation, you saw it in the Senate hearings. If you listened, the contrast of the platforms is so vibrantly clear now.
Yes.
And so if you're pressing into a biblical worldview, and particularly if you're a young adult listening to this, and you're saying, all right, what does the scripture say, and how do I let that be the rubric through which I examine where I'm going to cast my vote? Again, we want to say this: you should be voting. This is not the time to sit out. You need to get engaged, and I love hearing more voter engagement. That's a win across the board, particularly for young people who classically have not voted as consistently as we should have. The next step you need to take is look at the platforms, look at the stances, look at the positions, look at the values that you're hearing, and then ask yourself the question, from a biblical worldview standpoint, which of those platforms intersect most clearly with what the scripture says, particularly in the areas of life, of areas like law and order, of, what does real justice look like? When you start measuring it against those things, I really appreciated Senator Cruz's exchange with our friend Jack from Twitter this week.
Oh, yeah.
And man, that was intense, right? But that's a great snapshot of what a conservative viewpoint is going to offer to you. Is engaging, whether it's social media or public policy. We're bringing values to that conversation, and so be aware of those contrasts. Don't be ignorant of those, because I think that'll help prompt you on where to go with your vote.
Right. I think, voters have so many issues to grapple with. And I find this constantly in my work. I work in the pro-life movement on policy issues, just to advance life and help women ultimately choose life. Sure. But when I'm at speaking engagements or talking to anyone about these issues, they're like, well, I care about this issue. I care about immigration. I care about the economy. I mean, where do we begin, and how do we begin to create order and prioritize these issues? And I think that's such an important topic. I would love to spend some time on this. This is a great segue into our next topic, because there is a way to look at these issues from a moral standpoint and a biblical obligation standpoint even. And for me, that is in terms of moral consequence. So a lot of this can be deemed as right or wrong or neutral, right? Sure. Maybe just a different pathway towards the same goal and end on either side of your ticket. But at the end of the day, some issues result in life or death. Some issues result in harm to others. And those are the issues I think that should be given greater moral priority when you are voting. For instance, the issue of life and abortion. That is literally the only issue, one of the few I can think of on your ticket that's going to result in life or death. The foster care system and how people want to work toward protecting children or vulnerable among us. I mean, those are all issues that have moral implications, real justice issues, as you were referring to earlier. And then from there, you have other issues that are very, very important, affect your day-to-day lives. But maybe the Bible has a little bit less to say about taking a life than it does your tax rate and your tax bracket, right? But there's still very important issues.
Jesus said, "Pay your taxes."
He did.
Right?
You're absolutely right. But we've got to look at those party platforms and really pop the hood on the car, because I think what's happening is there's a lot of convolution in the commercials we're seeing and the ads you're seeing and the debates we're seeing, and you really need to know what the party you're voting for stands for. So when we get back, we're going to talk a little bit more about this moral obligation to vote and for whom. Is there a moral obligation? We're going to talk a lot more about that. Two heated debates, I hope, in front of us to discuss, and please stay with us.
2020. It's been a pretty eventful year. We've experienced international tensions over the coronavirus and lockdowns, economic uncertainties, cities overrun by protests, rioting, and looters, and coming soon, a presidential election. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kirby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It is easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
Hi, welcome back. It's Chelsey Youman. I'm your host today for the Millennial Roundtable, and we are getting into it. We have Jonathan Teague with us. He's the minister to married adults at Prestonwood Baptist Church. Thanks for being with us today, Jonathan.
You bet, Chelsea. It's great to be here.
Great. And also on the line, we have Rachel Redus with Senator Cruz's campaign. She's on staff with his campaign, so she is in it. Well, she's not in it right now because Cruz is not on the ballot yet, but she is in election season and can really help educate us and speak to us about what all is going on in the state of Texas. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you.
I know that on the last Millennial Roundtable, my big message to everyone was a message of hope and unity. And that is because I think we're all tired as a people. We're fatigued by politics. We're fatigued by divisiveness. So I really focused on our last roundtable a few weeks ago on just that hope we have and unity we have as a country and as America. But today I'm fired up. So we are going to dive into some more divisive issues. We have less than a week towards the election. And there are some narratives that are gaining traction that I think are just fundamental to believers in what is our moral obligation or duty, if any, to engage in politics, to vote, to not vote, for whom. Those are the questions before us. And I really want to dive into it. I'm fired up about this issue. So you guys are going to have to bear with me a little bit. I'm going to try to be objective as I present this initially, but we'll see how that goes. So I'll start with an article that came out on Desiring God. You can go to pointofview.net if you want to see any of the articles or topics we're talking about today. John Piper, a huge faith leader in our country and culture, wrote this article, and he is arguing that essentially many Christians should consider the sins of unrepentant immorality, boastfulness, vulgarity, factitiousness to be toxic for our nation, and that we need to look at that as and toxic in a way that is as detrimental as baby killing, sex switching, freedom limiting, I'm reading his article, and socialistic overreach, which are also deadly. And so he is essentially saying that any sin of the heart, biblically speaking, is just as deadly as sins that manifest in actual death. And that because of that, we have to consider the morality of the candidates and their character when we're voting. And because of that, he cannot, essentially vote for President Trump because he's bombastic. He has a boastful, prideful spirit. He's divisive. And so flagrant boastfulness, vulgarity, it's self-incriminating and their nation corrupting. And so his other point, and you guys correct me if I'm wrong on this, but is that bad company ruins it all. And so if his character is bad, then our entire country will flow from that. And the rest of those other policies will also ultimately be impacted. So this is a train of thought we're seeing on one side of the equation. Christians with strong faith saying they cannot come out and vote for President Trump in spite of his policies and track record that we've now had 4 years to view and see, in spite of him being a strong conservative, doing everything he can to defund Planned Parenthood, in spite of his views on life, religious liberty, freedom of speech, the economy being good. In spite of all of that, we have to say that because his apparent character has a lack of integrity, that you have a moral obligation not to vote for him. Okay, so that is one side of the equation. I have opinions about that, but we will get there.
Yeah, I do too.
Everyone, we will get there. So the next article that came out this week that is the other side of the equation is Albert Mohler. His article is also on pointofview.net, Christians' Conscience and the Looming 2020 Election. And this essentially says that while, yes, President Trump has a mouth on him and has a Twitter account and can, be bombastic and divisive, we don't have to stand up for the things he says. But that the moral, these are my phrases, the moral consequences of a Biden victory, a Biden-Kamala Harris victory, a Democrat Party platform victory, more so, it's so dire intangible in reality. More babies will be killed. Funding will go to Planned Parenthood. The Hyde Amendment will be repealed, and your taxpayer dollars will go towards paying for a woman's abortion. They are saying they're going to pack the courts. Your religious liberty on their Democrat Party platforms will be limited. That's just the beginning. I mean, we're not even talking about marriage, LGBT issues. You name the issue. If you're a conservative, it's on the line. And his argument is that the dire consequences are so great that you must look at policy over person and say, my moral obligation is to at all costs fight against the floodgates on the other side that have more dire moral consequences than divisive rhetoric. Okay. So I think that's the two arguments. I'm trying my best to keep it as fair as possible. And he even goes on to say in his article, look, if I were electing a neighbor, it would be Biden, hands down. He's the guy you want to have a burger with. But I'm not voting for who will be my neighbor. I am voting for who will be president of the United States and who is going to further policies that have moral consequences, which is why Christians have an obligation to engage, because these are issues with moral consequences. We're going to leave the economy out of it for now. And that necessarily life will be impacted by this, human life, the sanctity of life. And if this is a little bit, I'm going to get into my point and then I'll turn it over to y'all. But I think that we as Christians have a moral obligation to engage, because if we really believe what the Bible has to say about humans, if we really believe that God, He created us, we are beautifully and wonderfully made with a purpose that He designed. He has numbered our days. He has counted the hairs on our head, our tears. And He has done all of this because we have inherent human dignity. We are the only creature made in His image with a purpose, ultimately to glorify Him. If we believe that in the depths of our soul and that sin has corrupted us and the gospel prevails and we are to be saved, then we have a duty to engage in the worldly platforms that already exist, these institutions that maybe we didn't all create as Christians, but that already are the reality of the world we live in. We have a duty to engage and preach that message. It is the message of the gospel. The message of life is the message of the gospel. And I think that gets lost in Christian circles who want to be nice and not make enemies and want the world to see us as loving, which is good, right? And that's what the Bible calls us to do. But we're also called to say in what is more beautiful, if we protect life because we believe in inherent human dignity, then we protect children in the foster care system. We protect our neighbors who are widows. We protect those who are living in dire poverty circumstances around us. We protect others' right to speak because we know even if we disagree with them, that God created them and we respect them as fellow human beings. And I think that people lose the fact that politics flows from culture, which flows from our hearts as a religious people and a moral people, hopefully. And so all of this the moral conversations that I think John Piper's side wants to have, we have to understand we can only engage with that and challenge the moral infrastructure we're seeing if we're engaging. And if we sit home, then that's how ultimately we lead towards things like the Holocaust, because Christians didn't engage in time. We lead towards slavery because Christians sat home, and 200 years from now, when it comes to the life issue, everyone's going to turn around and say, where was the church? And we've seen it generation after generation, people asking, where was the church on that? And I think this is an important conversation to have. So, Jonathan, I'm going to get off my soapbox. You are actually in ministry. You work for a church and you engage. And I want to hear what fight me on anything I'm wrong. I love being challenged, and then agree with me when you think I'm right.
Sure. Yeah. No. Well, I mean, first of all, I think it's important to understand if you're a Christ following young adult listening to this today, understand two things. One, both of these men deeply love Jesus. They've contributed a massive amount to the church. And so I like to say often with my friends, heaven's a big tent. And so although we may find ourselves at different tables in different corners at times theologically, there's a binder called Jesus and the gospel, like you said. That's our commonality. What I think is unfortunately happening in the dialogue, particularly amongst young believers, is we're sort of picking, there's this us and them or me versus you mentality that ends up being driven then by the guy on my tribe that speaks most for me. Now, that's fair to an extent, but I think it's important for young adults as you're carving out your own personal faith, to recognize that there's a center point you stand on, and then you compare and you analyze those. And I know we'll get more to this in a minute, but those responses based off that center point. Short answer is this: I think that not just because I'm about to be a Southern Seminary graduate and have my doctorate from there.
Congratulations!
Thanks. I have a deep respect for Dr. Moeller, but just to say this to start the conversation, I'm concerned with Pastor Piper's false equivalency here. I'm not sure that I'm ready to jump on board with the idea that, the baffling and presumptuous to assume that pro-abortion policies kill more people than a culture saturating pro-self pride. I think that's a very dangerous equivocation there, because I can count the number of babies that have been aborted. That's a problem.
That's right. That's right. When we get back, Jonathan, we're going to hear more from you and from Rachel on this important debate about where Christians should go on their ballot and why.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Well, welcome back. We are having a great discussion here about just the Christian vote and our moral obligation. Do we engage? Do we not? And for whom? It is a binary choice after all, unless you're voting third party. And there's a lot of faith leaders in our countries, venerable people with strong convictions who are having some issues grappling with this election. So, Jonathan, I'm going to get it back to you because you were in the middle making some great points. And I just want to make sure we get, your perspective on this, especially as a pastor.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think we were saying earlier before the break, both of these gentlemen have contributed much to the kingdom, so much good, so much that's helpful in their writing and their thought and their preaching. I think we need to be clear about that. And I do think that there is a point of order here to be reminded as Christians that there is a a Christ-like civility that should dominate our mindset and our attitude. That being said, I'm Pastor Piper's argument concerns me, particularly, for instance, when he says Christians communicate a falsehood to unbelievers. That's a big statement. When we act as if policies and laws that protect life and freedom are more precious than being a certain kind of person. Insofar that I get his point there, but I think that there's an unnecessary equivalency that he's making. In other words, I think essentially when you boil down what he's saying is arrogance is just as bad as abortion.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I guess, yeah, and theologians like to discuss the realities that sin is sin, right? Yes, that's true. But I appreciate Dr. Mohler's argument when he comes back and says we're tempted to separate personal character, I'm quoting, and political policies as if they can be cleanly divided. So he really speaks directly to what Piper's saying. But character is policy and policy is character. And Dr. Mohler's view really, I think, is different than what he said in 2016, Chelsey. In this regard, he says right out of the gate in 2020, I'm going to vote for Donald Trump, and here's why. And when you take his very Edmund Burke classic Western Christianity construct undergirded by a biblical worldview, which I love about him, he really speaks to the issue there that, character is policy and policy is character. When you look at the policies that President Trump, this administration, and arguably down the ballot, as it were, in the Republican Party, at some point you have to concede the reality that policy is either a massive scam or it does speak, and I don't think it is, or it does speak to the character of those policies.
Right.
And so I think Dr. Mohler's point supersedes Pastor Piper's point in that Piper's not wrong per se in identifying the reality of sinful things, but I think Dr. Mohler's point is much more helpful in this space, particularly for young adults that are trying to parse this and have this discussion,
right? Because
those policies do point to a character,
right?
And so if you choose to separate,
in case our audience hasn't seen the policies we're talking about, President Trump has done more for conservative Republican platform issues than any other president, including on the life issue. If you want to know more about that, you can go online to our articles. We've got them listed, and it's just Trump's record at faithandfreedomcoalition.com. FRC.com has a list of his record. So you can really know, what has he done in the last 4 years? Because I can't bring that to top of mind, but it is significant. But I want to narrow down on something you're speaking to, which is, yes, the sin is morally equivalent, but this is an analysis as Christians I don't know that we always get into, which is how do we as a society know that certain sin actually has greater physical consequences than other sin. Yeah. And so the sin of pride results in a consequence of damaged relationships and self. Sure. The sin of stealing results in damaged property, and the sin of murder results in the loss of a life. And so we as a society can say, even though the moral sin might all be the same and require the same grace and forgiveness process that the cross provides us, they all result in different moral consequences, and therefore some moral issues are worse than others in our society. And I think even non-Christians recognize this. All you have to do to understand this is look at our criminal penal code, where some crimes have greater sentencing issues than others. And that's because even non-Christians can understand that there are worse consequences out there for the crime of murder than there are for the crime of petty theft. Yeah. And so those are basic ethical questions we have to look at. And when we go to the ballots, those are the issues you look at. Does Trump have a mouth on him? I think from a millennial perspective, that's a hard one because we don't in recent memory remember President Clinton's sex scandal. We don't. We weren't around for President Nixon's corruption and felony issues. We weren't around when President Kennedy, who's now romanticized in the history books, was having affairs very openly. And so our presidents have been very diplomatic. It's been President Bush that we recall both, and President Obama, who were diplomats. They were polished politicians. And so I think that's where a disconnect comes, is that our generation that maybe expects our presidents to look like diplomats. And the reality is they're fallen people. And the history shows us that that's not the case. Rachel, do you have any thoughts? I would love to get your opinion in the last few minutes we have before the end of the hour.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure. So I think whenever it comes to moral obligation to vote, we definitely as Christians have that moral obligation. And we also have the civil obligation as well. It was in Mark 12, I think, where Jesus told the Pharisees and Herodians, give to Caesar what's Caesar's and give to God what's God's. So we have a responsibility to be involved politically and a responsibility to focus on our relationship with God. I think evangelicals should be enthusiastic about being political, because if we don't have the good people fighting the good fight, then how, do we expect a good outcome or a good future for our economy? And I mean, here in the U.S., Christians have been afforded a unique and really great opportunity, which is freedom, because many Christians around the globe are being persecuted, just for their religious beliefs. So it's not something that we should take lightly, because we can't just stand, idly by as our freedom and way of life are, threatened. And with that being said, I think, my whole thought on the character analysis is our government has few jobs and should do those few jobs very well. And, as a voter, you should look to your president for three things: enforcement of the U.S. Constitution, security for our nation, and economic growth by cutting red tape and getting the government out of our way. That's what you should look for in a president. I don't, character is not something I base my vote off of. It's a personal choice, whether I, like the person's character or not. I choose policy over character because that's going to be around and make a much more significant impact and long-lasting impact than the person alone. So, in short, and at the end, I think the main goal of being involved politically for Christians should be, one, to speak for those who don't have a voice, which do include the unborn, and do the best we can really to ensure a vibrant future with the same freedoms that we enjoy today to our children and our future generations. I think that should be, the goal for us as Christians. We want to leave our children, with the same or a better country than we had, and the freedoms and everything that goes along with it. So I'm super passionate about that. I don't think that as a Christian you should sit at home and, hope everything, goes the way that you think it should or whatever. Politics, it's going to change our nation whether we as Christians become involved or not.
Absolutely. That's so beautifully said, Rachel. And Jonathan, before we close out for the hour, I'm going to kick it to you because I know you have one last thing to say.
No, yeah, and I totally hear Rachel's thought on that, and not at all to disagree with you, Rachel. But I think what I would say is, as the two narratives start to crystallize more and more, I can appreciate the idea of the character and the policy contrast. I don't think it's a contrast, and I think God. I mean, this, and I know what you're saying, Rachel, but I mean, not to over spiritualize. That's important. But God does use broken people to do interesting things throughout the Bible. You look at Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel. But I have to say this really quickly if you're a millennial listening to this, before we go to the break. It is really dangerous to create an equivocation that killing babies, unborn babies, is just as bad as being prideful.
Right.
There are massive implications to statements like that. And I do think we've got to pay much closer attention to the contrast of what we're seeing here in this election.
That's absolutely true. We've got to pay attention to these issues when we get back.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
Hi, welcome to Point of View. Today is our Millennial Roundtable edition. So excited to talk about what else the election right now. Of course, from millennial perspectives, it is the last week before the election, so we've got one final push here, but we have some current events to cover as well. We'll be talking this hour about the confirmation of now Justice Amy Coney Barrett, which is a historical confirmation that happened this week. We'll highlight a little bit about her hearings, and then discuss also this hour, of course, what else? Packing the courts, which is now apparently on the table for Democrats. So we can't go without talking about those issues. We have around the table with us David Fraga. Thank you so much for being with us here, David.
Yeah, I'm super excited to be here. It's always a pleasure just to come and just share my perspective.
Great.
Yeah.
David serves in ministry. He's at Gateway Church. He works on the men's ministry there. And I know in his free time does a lot of great work in the nonprofit realm. So we're happy to have him here always to give us the great biblical perspective. And then also on the phone, we have Richard Lim, my dear friend from Washington, D.C. And he is the head producer and voice of This American President, which is a great podcast. Go to your cell phones right now and pull up This American President in your podcast app. But thank you for being with us today, Richard. How are you?
I'm great. How are you doing?
We're doing well. I mean, I am about to just lose my mind reading the news so much. I know everybody in this election cycle, we're a little bit tired, but I was joking on the last hour about the last show we did a few weeks ago. I had a message of unity and hope for everyone because I know that everyone's a little bit fatigued with this election and we're just so ready to see what the final results are ultimately going to be next week. But then between then and now, I got a little mad because people started getting on my Facebook and calling Republicans all kinds of names that I can't even repeat on air. And I've seen really how divisive it's gotten. And I used to think that divisiveness was just in, the far echo chambers that you're hearing from the liberal media outlet based in New York and California, and that wasn't really the mainstream left. But then people I respected, very intelligent people I've grown up with or went to college with, started posting the craziest stuff. And I realized that maybe the mainstream left is actually more extreme than it used to be. And I'm always naive, always want to believe the best in people, but I'm seeing a sea change. And a lot of that came out, I think, or was really poignantly obvious to me in the confirmation hearings of now Justice Barrett. Justice Barrett has an outstanding record. She could not be more of an academic. She could not be more poised. I mean, she has a depth and breadth of knowledge of the law that is hard to come by, and just had an incredible performance in her hearings, whether that is as an academic. She's published, renowned as a professor. She is beloved. As a judge, she is fair, originalist, constitutionalist. And I think all of that presented well in not just an intellectual way, but in a very, she had a very calm demeanor. I mean, she was unshaken by no matter what they threw at her. And in response to what I would call the best judicial hearings I've ever seen a judge come through, in terms of her ability to respond without notes, mind you, to literally any case and issue asked of her. What was she handed by the Democrats? She was called a racist. She was accused of being an activist and overruling Obamacare, essentially hating people having health care. I mean, you name it, it happened. And then anti-woman, they lined up testimony after testimony, witness after witness. None of them knew her, by the way. None of them could speak to her character, her judicial record, or her publications fairly. All of them just lambasted her as public interest groups. I thought it was deeply unfair. And frankly, I thought it was anti-feminist in the way that they behaved and the way that they treated her. And so I want to talk about that. She is now confirmed Monday night this week. She took the oath in spite of all of that she endured, and her family and 7 children, by the way, had to endure. She made it through with grace, with intellect. And so I'm really proud of her as a woman, a legal mind of my own. I'm excited to see a female conservative attorney. I've never seen one in my lifetime. Put on the bench in my recent memories. So we're going to talk about that today. I know, Richard, you're on the line. Did you have anything you wanted to talk about, what you noted from her hearings and ultimate confirmation?
Yeah, so there are few things that bother the left more than minorities or women who are conservative. And so now the thing is that there's just the assumption there that if you're either one, and I mean, I'm a minority male and you're a female conservative, and both of us, according to them, shouldn't be able to think for ourselves. We should just automatically line up with the left. And so, yeah, unfortunately, because of that, there are a few things that anger them so much. It's like we belong to them. And so, unfortunately, they're taking that anger out on her and delegitimizing her whole process. And it's very presumptuous. And I think that's why you're seeing all these attacks on her.
You're absolutely right. David, I know that you've been watching the news a little bit the last few weeks, and just out of the election cycle, we're talking about that third branch of government, our judicial system, which is greatly at stake in the election. As president, whoever is chosen as president will be charged with ultimately nominating not just future justices, but at the lower court level, hundreds and hundreds of judges that see the bulk work of our case law. So what did you think about her confirmation? What do you have anything to add to what Richard said?
I think if anything, I'd just like to point out, I mean, for any person to go through the grilling that she went through and just being called what she was called, I mean, it's just so like a testament of the division in our country, right? And so it doesn't matter if like that person was left or right, per se, just like out of unbiased perspective, that was very like intense, right? And all the scrutiny that she went through. But I think it's a testament of just like, that is where we're at as a country. And it's like, things are very aggressive in terms of just like politically, a lot of divisiveness and just what people are just calling out, right? It's easy to try to point something wrong, right? I mean, even Jesus says this, like, it's easy to call a speck out of someone's eye instead of the plank out of your own eye, per se, right? But all that being said, I think it was, I just heard of it through the news and then I watched a little bit of it, but I wasn't watching too many of the hearings, honestly. But I think it's interesting, just there was so much peace about like the people that were trying to, fight for her, and I think it's incredible to see that there's this strong, woman who is going to be able to make such a big impact in the next generations to come. After, I've been following a lot of evangelicals and they just keep talking about this is definitely, a divine appointment. This is God doing what he's doing in this country in order to end like abortions, in order to reverse a lot of laws, right, per se.
Well, we certainly hope so. We know that she is an originalist, which means that she believes the Constitution at the time of its adoption is the four corners of that Constitution are unchanged over time. And so I think what we're alluding to here is for our voters who are out there looking at both sides of the tickets, there are very real, meaningful differences between the two parties you have to choose from. And we saw that come out in the hearings. We'll talk a little bit more about that after the break that's coming up. And then we're going to get on to packing the courts and what Vice President Biden has now alluded to, a sneak peek. He wouldn't commit to it, so we're not quite sure when we get back. And I know Richard will have some great historical analysis for us on what is packing the courts and where do we even get those ideas from after this break. So stay tuned and don't go anywhere.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
One argument used to prove systemic racism is the extent of racial disparities. On the internet, you will find lots of charts that show differences between black and white that are used to prove racism. One way to respond to these charges is to look at one of the last columns ever written by black economist Thomas Sowell with the provocative title, Football and Fallacies. He talks about the reaction from some of the players in the NFL when a black punter took the field. One of the defenders cried out, "Fake." His reaction was understandable since you never see a black kicker in the NFL. Thomas Sowell put it this way: "I've seen hundreds of black players score touchdowns, but not one kick the point after. I've seen a black president of the United States before I've seen a black kicker in the NFL." Now, he's obviously questioning the assumption that statistical differences between racial groups indicate discrimination. But does that mean there is discrimination among kickers in professional football? Well, not at all. We all know the answer to that question. Owners and coaches will pick the best player regardless of their ethnic background. In fact, they might even take foreign players who can't even speak English if they can kick a football. The lesson here, of course, is that we have been told for decades that statistical differences are automatically a reason to suspect discrimination, whether between races or sexes. He even goes on to remind us that some of the differences in wages between men and women have more to do with different career choices. So let's be honest, some statistical differences do point to discrimination, either overt or subtle. But in most cases, the differences are due to other factors that have nothing to do with discrimination. That's the lesson we can learn from this football story. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Racism, go to viewpoints.info/racism. That's viewpoints.info/racism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Hi, welcome back to Point of View. Today is our Millennial Roundtable edition where we're covering the election and all kinds of current events and topics from a millennial perspective. Around the table today, we have David Fraga, and on the line, we've got Richard Lim. And we've just been discussing Amy Coney Barrett's, her hearings, her nomination process, and her ultimate confirmation, which happened this week, which leaves us now with a conservative appointment, 6-3 majority. That is really historically significant. For one, we have not had a conservative majority on the Supreme Court since the 30s, so almost 90 years now. And that has a real, genuine impact for decades and generations to come, what the Supreme Court makeup is on our country, on our culture, and on our lives. And so I can't emphasize enough how important that is, that this happened. And of course, at the lower court levels, nominations will continue to occur in the hundreds over the next 4 years. Which leads us back to the election, of course. One thing we just discussed, though, or alluded to at least, was that the confirmation hearings really brought out some genuine differences between the parties, that the Democrat and the Republicans. I'm going to try to be fair about it. I'm not always very fair or objective, as everybody knows. But on one side, we saw that the Democrats continued over and over again to address questions with her about judicial activism, wanting results-oriented judging, saying that ultimately they wanted judges to reach certain results regardless of the laws or statutes on certain issues, which some argue would be politicizing the courts. But that ultimately results-oriented judging is the most important way to do that. Now, of course, as an attorney, we know that if judges care more about results than the way that the methodologies they get towards those results, it leads to a lot of confusion in the courts, a lot of back and forth in the law and judicial activism. On the other side, we heard the Republicans' mantras about originalism, textualism, and staying true to a consistent methodology, the four corners of the Constitution, which is unchanging. And we saw that the way the left treated her was different than the way the right treated her in terms of respecting someone who disagrees with them ultimately on their judicial philosophies. One of the ways that I would like to say this is rule of law or adherence to constitutional constraints. I think those are important things to know, that those are real issues on your ballot, because Republicans who are originalists tend to say that the Constitution constrains us in terms of separation of powers, in terms of our ability, all kinds of things, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, you name it, that the Constitution provides constraints to governing officials and that their power is not unlimited. Democrats tend to think that the Constitution is a moving, living, breathing document. It changes over time. And that because of that the rules should be bent a little bit more in light of culture or whatever we're facing today. One of the ways, as a great example, I think we should look at this is the recent thing that's come to light, that the Democrats are considering packing the courts. So that would be what I would call bending the rules, right? Where we say that the Constitution is bending, that the Democrats should be allowed because they don't like the results of the election. They don't like the results of a judicial nomination that puts them out of the majority they have had and held for 90 years, that they should be allowed to bend the rules in very significant ways. So on the line is Richard Lim. Tell us a little bit about packing the courts. What does it mean? Has this ever been done before or considered before, Richard?
Yeah, well, the first thing I want to say, you were distinguishing between how the left and the right looks at the role of the courts. And I'm just going to quote former President Barack Obama, who said, quote, "I wondered if in our reliance on the courts to vindicate not only our rights but also our values, progressives had lost too much faith in democracy." Now, Barack Obama was essentially admitting that the courts were basically a last resort to circumvent democracy. Of course, he continued that process in who he appointed to the courts. But I think if progressives are honest with themselves, they would ask that question, are they, by changing the rules, by interpreting the Constitution however they want, have they lost faith in what the people wanted and our democratic process? As far as packing the courts, so even back in 1912, this has been a progressive agenda for a while. Back in 1912, President Theodore Roosevelt, who ran as a progressive that year, supported judicial recall, which would have subjected court decisions to the voters. And so that was kind of the first attempt or proposal you saw to undermine the independence of the judiciary. As we know, President Franklin Roosevelt did so in his second term. And if you look at the context of it, Roosevelt had been reelected in 1936 in one of the biggest landslides in American history. He won 46 out of 48 states. So he basically felt like the equivalent of a political god in America and tried to get justices appointed for every justice over 70 years old. And that would have given him a majority to approve his New Deal legislation. And a lot of that legislation was struck down. It's a cautionary tale because not only did the legislation fail, it failed because of an opposition within his own party. And the Democrats in the subsequent midterm elections would go on to lose 8 seats in the Senate, 81 seats in the House. So even political gods have limits on what they can do. And the last thing I'll say about court packing is that I think the last word should go to Justice Ginsburg, who said on the current number of justices, quote, 9 seems to be a good number. It's been that way for a long time. It was a bad idea when Franklin Roosevelt tried to pack the court. If anything, it would make the court look partisan. And so basically, for any people on the left that want to pack the court, they should look at Justice Ginsburg's words and President Roosevelt's experience when they tried to do the same thing.
Those are some really great points. I mean, I love what you're saying about just the fact, the idea of packing the court was ultimately, it began with it was a power grab. an overreach of
Mhm.
authority, an overstep of authority. And then what you alluded to, which is that it would ultimately result in making a court a legislative body, which I know I've seen some commentators say and acknowledge that we really don't want our courts to become a voting system or a legislative body. They're supposed to be removed from that because we have Congress. We have legislative body as a separate branch of government. The court is supposed to be limited to stating whether their laws passed are or are not constitutional. David, I know that you read the article that we've got posted on pointofview.net in case any of our audience also wants to read our articles about packing the courts or any of the other topics we've discussed today. David, what are your thoughts on the Democrats or what I would say Vice President Biden said, I won't commit to whether I'm going to pack the courts or not. I'll tell you after the election, which of course is hiding the ball. I mean, I'm a big proponent of transparency with our government officials. So
it's showing it.
Voters
it's showing the ball. But it's like, saying, I'm just going to set it over here for now, basically.
Yes, exactly.
No, the perspective that I'm thinking about is I just have a lot of questions that I ask. Like, okay, so what is the role of the justices, honestly? Is it to create laws and pass bills and things like that will allow the people to be happy with the public ones? Or is it to keep a standard of morality in a way over the land, right? And so I always ask these questions to myself because, I mean, the perspective that you're giving or the definitions of like, okay, the Democrats think it's more of a living, breathing document that changes over time. Republicans think it's, very more like what's translated from the original time it was written. And so my thoughts are that there is their perspective or different people's perspectives shifting a foundational things, or that's what they think when they say, okay, we're going to bend the rules a little bit. Are they actually trying to shift foundational things by packing the courts? Because in that place, then it will start to implode, right? And things will start to fall apart. Or is it to build a bridge of a different perspective? And so these are just some questions. And I want to actually ask you something just to bring a little bit more clarity in this issue, especially for me as a millennial. What is the difference between a statute and something that's dictated versus a statute versus something dictated by the Constitution? And so, like I was going back to the standard that they're supposed to uphold the standard of the law of the land, right? Because even people are, you said, making power grabs. How can we hold that standard per se? How can they do that?
That's a great question. And I have just a minute before our break to address it. But essentially, the Constitution is like the founding document. It takes precedent in terms of value and importance. And it is the principled guiding document that all laws flow from there. And so the Constitution was created by our founders. And Richard, I can't wait to hear what you have to say about this after the break. Essentially, as a body of constraints, to go ahead and explicitly say these are the separation of powers. These are limits on government that should not be changed. It requires a supermajority in Congress in order to change or amend the Constitution. Then we have the Bill of Rights, which outlined originally our top 10 rights that are explicitly stated and protected. And then from there, Congress is free to pass laws to govern in general, govern society, govern criminal areas of the law, commerce, the economy. But it is always limited by the Constitution. So when we get back, I'd love to hear what Richard has to say after this break. Go ahead and go to pointofview.net or follow us on Facebook where you can actually see us as we talk. But stay tuned. We'll be back right after this.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team. and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
Welcome back. I'm Chelsey Youman today, your host of the Millennial Roundtable. We've got with us David Fraga, who is involved in Gateway Church, men's ministry, and a whole host of nonprofit work. Welcome, David.
Glad to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
And on the line, thank you, Richard, for joining us. He is the producer, voice of the famous This American President podcast. He brings us always such a great historical perspective on anything we're talking about. So welcome, Richard.
Thank you. Always good to be here.
Yes, well, we are talking about packing the courts. We talked about Justice Barrett's confirmation in her hearings, and some of that was brutal to watch, but she got through it and is ultimately confirmed. But David had a really great question for us before the break. He's been asking about really what is the role of the Constitution versus laws and statutes. And on the break, he actually asked, and Richard, this is a great question for you to answer. He asked, what role, if any, should the Constitution have in expanding to cover new issues? You mentioned the digital age, things that come our way as a culture that maybe weren't happening in the 1700s or would have been completely foreign and alien to our founding fathers. Should the Constitution actually be changed or grow over time to accommodate those types of things?
Right. So basically, the Constitution, now you're the lawyer, so I'm just speaking kind of from the historical perspective. But what I do know is that the founders created the Constitution because there were bedrock principles that they felt that government should be built upon. The idea of limited government to protect the rights, but also a competent and energetic government that had enough power to do what it needed to do. Before the Constitution, we had a very weak government that couldn't raise money. And basically, and it didn't have enough power to create a viable national defense. And so the Constitution was built for that purpose. And so originalists want to keep the principles that underlie that foundation because they know that, well, the rule of law is basically a prerequisite for any functioning society. But being an originalist doesn't mean that you're straitjacketed in terms of policy. That's why they allowed for Congress to pass laws to deal with new situations. They knew that times would change and new policies would be needed as technology advances, as society became more enlightened, as it progressed to a more perfect union. And so that's what the laws are for. Originalists merely say that the Constitution is adequate to do that. You don't need to reinterpret the principles of the Constitution in order to have new policies. And that's what I think Barack Obama was alluding to, where he said that he felt that using the courts too often was basically circumventing and undermining democracy. And that's essentially what they do. So I think there's this misperception that originalism and believing in what the Constitution means somehow straitjackets you to that time. That's not at all what it means. Originalism accommodates the fact that times change and new policies are going to be necessary, and the founding principles are adequate to have new policies. Just make sure that you're basing that on the basic fundamental principles of limited government and respect for the rights of the citizens.
I think that's so well said, Richard. I mean, you couldn't have said it better than to explain just really those root differences. And if we want to translate this for our audience in terms of like, what does this mean for us as voters, as we're facing election on Tuesday or early voting today? If you just want to go ahead and go vote right now, that's a great idea. But how this translates is these are really meaningful differences. This isn't just a history lesson or a philosophical or ideological difference. These are meaningful differences for your life. Because, generally Republicans and conservatives, the Republican Party platform speaks to rights being alienable rights we're born with, we're given and granted by God, the right to free speech, the right to vote, the right to act in accordance with our conscience, defend ourselves. All of those are rights that should not be changed, should be protected at all costs, regardless of what society really throws our way, that those are just bedrock principles for us as humans. Whereas the left and the Democratic Party platform says, well, as society changes, we can limit those rights if we don't like those rights, for instance, or if they're no longer popular, that we as a society, we change, that they're immutable rights, and that over time they can be eroded if we think there's a reason good enough to justify that. And so those are really meaningful differences. And what this means for the election is when you elect a president who is either a Democrat or a Republican, your binary choice on your ticket, the Republican will be appointing conservative judges who are originalist and adhere to the idea that your rights should not be changed or eroded over time, regardless of what society says, who will defend those rights in the court of law. And we're not just talking the Supreme Court, which has gotten a lot of traction right now, but we're talking hundreds of lower district courts that see 99% of cases are decided in the lower courts, over 99% actually. Those judges will be appointed by a Republican or a Democrat. And if President Biden wins, he'll be appointing judges who say, actually, we should restrict rights based on this consideration or this change historically that's happened right now, this cultural interest that we like. Those are meaningful differences. These judges who are appointed, they will impact your life for decades to come because after all, they are lifetime appointments. And so something I just really wanted to make sure we hit on before we move on to our next topic is getting out to vote. It is related to these big principles we're talking about. With that, our next topic is not to forget about the Senate, because we're hearing a lot about the presidential election, the debates, these hearings, but really we have an entire chamber of our Congress up for grabs right now, and that is the Senate. And if Democrats are currently in the majority in the House, we've got Speaker Pelosi on that side, Republicans hold the Senate, Republicans hold the White House. So what this means is the Senate is a few seats away from being held by a Democrat majority. Richard, can you speak to that?
Yeah, so the GOP holds the lead in the Senate, 53 to 47. It's a tight race. Control of the Senate, as you mentioned, it plays a big role in dictating the composition of the Supreme Court, possibly for generations. We've seen that in President Trump's term so far. The Democrats look strong in places like Arizona and Colorado. They only need 3 seats for a majority if Trump wins, only 2 if Biden wins, and that's because if there's a tie, the vice president would be the tie-breaking vote. I think you're going to see Maine, North Carolina, and Iowa as basically the big battlefields for whether the Senate goes either for the GOP or for the Democrats. And I think a lot of the result will depend on turnout and how much of President Trump's coattails can get many of them over the line. If President Trump wins re-election, I think you're potentially going to see coattails for him in those states. If you look at Trafalgar Group and Investor Business Daily polls, you're seeing that I think Georgia is probably going to go to the Republican Party. I think Democrats love to fancy themselves the idea that maybe Texas could go Democrat, but in my opinion, that's nonsense. And I think, Chelsey, you could probably speak more to that. And the same with Lindsey Graham in South Carolina. And so this is going to be a tough race. It's going to be very tight. And as you just said, every vote counts because it's not just a vote for your senator. It's also a vote for people that are going to approve the next justice. And as we know, you don't need a filibuster to block a justice anymore, or that's not an option anymore.
Right. That's absolutely true. And, Richard, I think it's so important for our voters to just remember that really all 3 branches are up right now, because if President Trump does not win re-election and the Democrats take the Senate, they'll have the trifecta. They will have all of Congress, the ability to pass whatever laws on their Democratic platforms, which are worth reading if you have not read them. And then, of course, President Biden would go ahead and sign off on all those laws. So what we're facing here is the last stopgap, these few seats between a Democrat swell in their party platforms and their agenda. We know they'll use the administrate regardless of if they keep the Senate or not to really push forward their issues. But it's so important, especially if you're in some of these states like Arizona and Maine, where your Senate race is really potentially going to change the voting pattern for Congress. Those are not to be overstated. Right now, we have 23 Republican Senate seats up in the election, and 12 Democratic Senate seats are up in the election. So the Republicans, they have a lot to lose. They have a lot on the line this election. And of course, getting out to vote, even right now, if you're like, oh, it's early voting, I should just go do that. Get in your car and just go drive and vote if you really want a voice in this election, because it's meaningful. Your vote does make a difference, not just at the presidential level, level, but down ballot, your state races, your local officials that really impact your day to day. Those are all on the line right now. David, we're about to go to a break. When we get back, we're going to hear more from you on the Senate, all of these seats that are up, who's in contested states, so that you guys as listeners can know, oh, my state, that's on the list. I better make sure to get out and vote. You can follow us on Facebook.com where you can watch us, or pointofview.net. Don't forget to visit our website to read about all of these issues we've discussed and more right after this break.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back. We've been talking about a whole host of issues on the Millennial Roundtable today. Earlier on the show, we talked about Texas. Is it really turning blue? We actually don't know the answer to that question, but voter turnout is at an all-time high. So we really discussed some of that. Do we have a moral obligation to vote, and for whom? We're going to revisit that topic in the next hour. And then, of course, Justice Barrett's confirmation, packing the courts have all been on the table today. We have on the line Richard Lim, and we were just talking about, not forgetting about the Senate, that is absolutely on your ballot. If the top of your ticket is a big question mark for you, if you're really grappling with some of those issues, we're going to discuss how, as Christians, are we morally obligated to vote, if we are at all, later. But below that top of your ticket, there are so many candidates down ballot that are worth really understanding. Knowing the party platforms, I think, is foremost, because before any candidate can actually be supported by a party, they sign off on the party platforms. So So go read the Democrat Party platforms, read the Republican Party platforms, see what resonates with you and your conscience. But important to note on that is the Senate. So your senators, we are really close. It's really close in that chamber of Congress. We're within 3 votes, really, of a majority one way or the other. So, David, you read the articles about the Senate. You know, we have Senator Cornyn is on the ballot in the state of Texas. Any thoughts on the importance or significance of those races?
Absolutely. So first and foremost, I just want to encourage everyone, it is important to vote. You're voting for so much more than just one seat, you know, the presidency and things like that. But I think it's easy to lose sight, and it's hard to focus a lot of times because of where, when we're watching the news, when we're reading all of these articles, we kind of can get distracted. That it's about the big picture, right? About all the little details and whatnot. And so I just want to encourage everyone, go vote, do your homework, read, and you know, ask God to guide you in that, right? Because honestly, we do need the Lord's help in everything. We need to be dependent on His grace, right? And I think it's really interesting. I love how this article, it says, hey, let's not forget about the Senate. Like, it's so, like I was saying earlier, it's so easy to do that. But I think I want to ask a question, honestly, and that's just what I love to do, right? How do we continue to adapt and continue to solidify, you know, what we're talking about earlier, even the bedrock through these, like, the Senate, per se, by just investing our time and being like, okay, these people are going to be, you know, representing us, right? Especially in Texas, that's where we're at right now. And so what does that look like to continue to solidify, to continue supporting these policies, these people? How can we do that more right now as a voting citizen?
Right. I think first, it always for me comes down to understanding who you're voting for, and they have a track record. I mean, your senators have voting records. I think one of the most telling things to me when I spoke with members of my state legislature here in the state of Texas about, you know, you personally espouse to be pro-life or espouse this issue, but you vote a different way. And one of the things one of the members said was, they said, I don't hear from the 3,000 pro-life people in my district. I hear from the 300 feminists who show up outside my office and protest. Wow. They're the ones I'm seeing. They're the ones calling me. They're the ones sending me letters about different pieces of legislation. And that activism is something that your elected official truly listens to. And so if you are passionate about an issue, you know, we talked about this earlier, like the calling to engage on that beyond just voting is, of course, first and foremost, that's paramount to our democracy. But looking beyond that and saying, are you paying attention to what bills they're sponsoring, where their votes are? Are you calling their offices? You could put a petition around your church. If there's a piece of legislation, like, for instance, the Born Alive Infant Protection Act, which can't get traction through the Senate right now because essentially it says that any infant born alive after a botched abortion should receive basic medical care as part of they're a human. And that bill is not passing. If that's something that makes your stomach turn, call your elected officials, just make it known. And I think advocacy, it's a beautiful thing. It's a part of our democracy. We're seeing a lot of it this year. We're being fatigued at all ends. But at the end of the day, you have a responsibility as a citizen to call your elected officials, to make sure to vote for them, know the party platforms. Richard, do you have anything you want to add for that in our last few minutes here?
Excuse me. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that it's unfortunate that a lot of people don't get engaged at the local level, and it's a cliche that all politics is local, but it's true. And so I think that in the end, that's really what moves people. When people nowadays with social media, it's easier to get the word out than ever before. But one thing I do want to emphasize and just kind of maybe dramatize a little bit with some historical context, you're absolutely right about how important it is for people to vote, especially Christians. In 2000, the 2000 election, the presidential election, 100 million people voted. And the entire election, as we know, came down to one state, Florida, and the winner of that state won by 537 votes out of 100 million cast. And that changed history. That put George W. Bush, as we know, in the White House. So just imagine that. And that's a national election. So every vote matters at the state level, at the local level, and at the presidential level. And so for anyone who's thinking that it's inconvenient or anything like that, the history of the nation and the world is molded by the results of these elections, and you have a role to play.
Thank you so much for that reminder, Richard. I mean, I was a little bit younger, not quite old enough to be following all of this. And millennials, we were talking early on the show, we have a kind of a short memory because we have a short history, and sometimes that works against us. I think it's so important to understand where we come from and just how close these things can be. Younger voters typically do not vote. When they do vote, it's traditionally going to be on the Democrat side. But I would encourage all voters, again, just to read the party platforms. They're very telling on where we're going. Some of the differences between the parties, I think, came out very poignantly in the last debate we saw. The rhetoric on Biden's ticket was, we are victims. The world is hard. A dark winter is coming. And because of all of this, the government, Big Daddy government, has all your solutions. We're going to pay for your insurance. We're going to pay for your school. The government's going to bail out all of these people on COVID. I saw, just like literally in my mind, dollar signs floating from his voice because it's just everything seemed really expensive. But that's a Democrat. That's a Democrat perspective, is that the government is there to help, to assist. It's responsible for helping and assisting. On the other side of the ticket, we saw President Trump speak to individual responsibility and duty and delegating to humans to self-govern a little bit more in these scenarios and trusting humans that they have, the ability to do that, and that the government should be scaled back. And it's really a citizen's responsibility to lean into some of this. So we're going to go to a break at the end of the hour for our last minute. But I think these differences, they're important. They're meaningful for us as voters, as a people. And we have so much more to cover after our break. But before that, I want to say thank you, David, for joining us. Tell our listeners, where can they follow you? Where can they learn more about your ministry?
Absolutely. So you can actually check me out at kingdominitiative.org. It's our website. It's the nonprofit I run, but also myself, you can follow me on Instagram at the David Fraga, or Facebook, David Fraga as well. So.
Wonderful. And Richard, I want to end with you. Where can our audience hear more about you and your incredible historical work?
Sure. thisamericanpresident.com. They can also look up our podcast on iTunes. Feel free to, they can support us on Patreon too. We have a Patreon account.
Absolutely. Go to Patreon, support This American President. Hear from Richard. His voice is so soothing on his podcast as he tells you actually so much really great, helpful information. Go ahead and go to pointofview.net if you want to read these articles, read anything about the topics we've discussed today. We're also on Facebook Live, so you can be watching us right now as we millennials just grapple with what this world has to offer us right now. When we get back, we've got more to cover, so stay tuned with us. We'll be back after this break.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do. in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
Hi, welcome to Point of View, the Millennial Roundtable. I'm your host today, Chelsey Youman, and I'm joined by two incredibly brilliant millennials. I cannot wait to hear from them today. We've got David Fraga, who is with Gateway Church, the men's ministry at Gateway Church. He's here to just bring us some truth, add some scripture and coloring to our commentary today. Thank you for joining us, David.
It's an honor to be here. Thank you for having me.
We also have as a guest today, Liberty McArtor. I think I said it right. Yeah. She is a staff writer at Point of View and a writer. I worked with her at First Liberty Institute. She always has such an incredible perspective. So thank you for joining us today, Liberty.
Thank you, Chelsey. I'm happy to be here.
Well, we have had a robust show today. We have talked everything from Texas voter turnout being at an all-time high and potentially going blue to the confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett and her new role as a Supreme Court justice. We also talked about her hearings. Packing the courts was on the table, and voting on the for your senators, which really it's coming to the wire on that. The Senate could go either way. So really today's show is about just encouraging voters to get out and vote, but also to be really informative about the real consequences and differences between the parties on your ticket and your vote. So with that in mind, today we're going to turn towards the question that a lot of Christians are asking right now. We're seeing it elevated really everywhere on the internet, in the news cycle, discussions in churches from the pulpit going towards, do we have a moral obligation to vote? And if so, for whom? Those are really big questions that we as Christians are grappling with, especially when we look at fallen political candidates who have a mouth on them, for lack of a better term. So I'm going to try to be as objective as I present this as possible, and then we'll get into my opinion, because you guys know I have an opinion about everything.
That's great.
One article that is gaining a lot of traction and heat right now in the public sphere is John Piper's article on Desiring God. It is on our website, pointofview.net. And he discussed essentially, he equated moral deprivation and failing, moral sin, as the same as physical sin that results in death. So he said it's the same as baby killing, sex switching, and freedom limiting, socialistic overreach, that all of that is the same as moral sin. And for that reason, he does not want to vote in this election. And so this is a common trend. David French is of this mindset. We're seeing publications on this that essentially, because of the character failings of President Trump, or perceived character failings, so I actually cannot speak for his character, that Christians should not essentially vote for him because he has these moral failings. And then the policies flow down in our country from moral failings as a whole. And so we start with the character. That is one train of thought. The other train of thought is the other article that is posted on our website, which Albert Mohler really, I think, hit home on this. Eric Metaxas has some great articles on this as well. Essentially, the argument being that neither candidate has the moral high ground, that there are moral implications on both sides of the ticket, but the policy results have really serious, dire consequences, and those dire consequences outweigh the moral issues of the people that we're voting for. And because we're voting for a party and not a person, we really have to think about things like, will lives tragically continue to die because of abortion? If we vote for Democrats who want to continue to fund abortion, repeal the Hyde Amendment so your taxpayer dollars pay for abortions, and say that the greater moral priority is to vote, and to vote based on policies that have meaningful implications for people around us. So those are the two corners we're in. I would love to hear from both of you and your perspectives on this. I'll just start by saying that I think Eric Metaxas really had a great article actually in 2016 before President Trump even had a policy record to speak of. And he said that throughout, this really actually convinced me how to vote. But he said throughout the slavery movement and the Holocaust both, that there were really serious issues that they had to combat. Slavery and the obvious horrific things that flow from slavery, and the Holocaust, which was resulting in the death of millions. And that the moral priority was on voting for failed guys like Bonhoeffer, who did have moral failings. He tried to kill Hitler at one point in a secret scheme. And then in the slavery side of the movement, there were also leaders who had personal moral failings, but that because there were such serious issues at hand, that people ultimately looked past that to join the movements to eradicate slavery for the greater common good, because society needed to hear that as a whole. And I think that that's probably going to be where I fall on the side of this equation, is that as believers, because we believe that God loves us, that we are sinful and fallen in need of a savior, but that he has put significant human dignity on us as humans. He orders our steps. He creates our days. He counts the hairs on our head. He counts our tears. That God loves us. He creates us fearfully and wonderfully for a divine purpose to ultimately glorify him. And that if we genuinely believe that as believers, if we believe what the gospel has to say about humans, our nature, and his saving grace, then we are called to engage in the world to perpetuate that truth. And the world has arenas for that. It's politics, it's society, it's culture, it's the media, it's publications, anything you can think of where we engage in the world to speak that truth in love. And for me, the life issue flows from those foundations. If we protect the most vulnerable among us, the unborn in the womb, we protect foster children, we protect widows. Everything flows from understanding the importance of protecting human dignity and human life. And so I think that we have a duty and a moral obligation to engage on those issues. But John Piper disagrees with me. So I would love to hear what you guys have to say about this. Let's go ahead and start with you, David, before we hit the break. Then we'll go back to Liberty. What were your initial thoughts on this topic as a believer and a voter?
I think it's super interesting because you brought up the greater good. What is the greater good? I think we use that term a lot when it comes to self-justifying why we do what we do. Mm-hmm. It's okay, so we see all this destruction that's taking place that is hurting the people who I love, what I think is good and true, not just that, but core foundational beliefs. And so if it's affecting or threatening that, then what can I do in order to justify my actions that are to come, right? So I think that is a good wrestle. And I love how John Piper, he's a Christian guy, right? And so are we. And so we focus on, okay, so where is he coming from? The perspective that he's trying to engage on this. And I'm a big fan in terms of just using scripture and wrestling with what God says in scripture. I think it's so important for in all aspects of our lives. If we are not wrestling with what God is speaking into our hearts, we have this wrestle with spirit and flesh, right? And so it's very, very important that's an invitation is what it is. An invitation to what? Intimacy with him. As we draw nearer to God, he promises to draw nearer to us. And in that there's clarity. And so I think this article in itself, he's wrestling in a way. Obviously, he's taking a stance from one side versus another, right? But at the same time, a verse that just keeps coming up to mind is how can we address these things from a place of love and grace, right?
That is so true. I can't wait to hear more, David, on your thoughts on this, and you too, Liberty, because I know we have lots to discuss, to unpack really how we as believers grapple with the decision to vote and the candidates in front of us. So we'll hear more after the break, so stay tuned.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
One argument used to prove systemic racism is the extent of racial disparities. On the internet, you will find lots of charts that show differences between black and white that are used to prove racism. One way to respond to these charges is to look at one of the last columns ever written by black economist Thomas Sowell with the provocative title, Football and Fallacies. He talks about the reaction from some of the players in the NFL when a black punter took the field. One of the defenders cried out, "Fake." His reaction was understandable since you never see a black kicker in the NFL. Thomas Sowell put it this way: I've seen hundreds of black players score touchdowns, but not one kick the point after. I've seen a black president of the United States before I've seen a black kicker in the NFL. Now, he's obviously questioning the assumption that statistical differences between racial groups indicate discrimination. But does that mean there is discrimination among kickers in professional football? Well, not at all. We all know the answer to that question. Owners and coaches will pick the best player regardless of their ethnic background. In fact, they might even take foreign players who can't even speak English if they can kick a football. The lesson here, of course, is that we have been told for decades that statistical differences are automatically a reason to suspect discrimination, whether between races or sexes. He even goes on to remind us that some of the differences in wages between men and women have more to do with different career choices. So let's be honest, some statistical differences do point to discrimination, either overt or subtle. But in most cases, the differences are due to other factors that have nothing to do with discrimination. That's the lesson we can learn from this football story. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Racism, go to viewpoints.info/racism. That's viewpoints.info/racism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Thanks for joining us. I was just talking to David Fraga on the Millennial Roundtable about Christians voting, and of course, we're talking about the importance of having a civil dialogue about the importance of voting and who you vote for, and what the Bible has to say about that. So, David, take it away. Where do you stand in this debate? On one side, we have great faith leaders in our country talking about the need to really focus on character as paramount in your vote. And then on the other side is like David Metaxas and Albert Mollard, who are speaking to really the issues and saying like there are serious moral consequences, even death relating to your vote, and that there's more obligations there. Where do you fall on this side of the equation?
Well, I like to give a little context before I say okay, this is what I fall in the equation, right? So I think it's really important, just perspective. I love to see both sides of the table, per se. Not just both sides, but the whole picture. I want to see the whole picture. And so by doing that, I have to ask questions that I'm even uncomfortable, like asking myself and writing down things, right? And so I think a lot of times when we're making a decision, we think about what maybe this person or this decision is making us feel. And a lot of times we can be led by our feelings, which aren't always reliable, right? In the same way, when we look at candidates, when we look at other people, we're like, okay, I don't like that person's personality, it rubs me the wrong way. When in reality, shouldn't we be looking at the character, the actions, right? Something I always say to people is a culture of honor. Something I always want to create in the environments I'm in is a culture of honor. With that, it produces the fruit of respect. It produces the fruit of love, peace, all those things, right? It produces so many things. Honor is something that our generation does not understand or know about when it comes to people. Therefore, we talk a lot about it, right? We say, oh yeah, I want to honor that person, I want to respect them. But words precede action. action displays the motive of the heart. And so out of the overflow of the heart, we speak. Out of the overflow of the heart, we do. Therefore, in the intimacy, like I was talking about earlier, as we draw near to God and spend more time into his presence and intimacy with him, it begins to transform us inside out, right? So it's very important that we see that. And I think a lot of pastors and preachers and evangelicals are wrestling with that, especially now. What is the greater good? What is the best decision to make on these candidates and whatnot? And so for me, I really do, I'm looking at the character of the person more than the personality. And I'm leaning towards just like, okay, these are the traits. These are the pursuits. No one is perfect. No man is perfect, right? That's why we are dependent on God's grace. That's why we need Jesus. And so we need someone who's pressing nearness towards him. Why? Because out of the overflow of the heart, they do.
I think that those are such incredible points. I haven't even heard anyone make that distinction between personality and character. And then, we did talk a little bit earlier with Jonathan Teague on the show about if the right policies are happening, which they are. You can go on our website and see FF Coalition, Faith and Freedom Coalition, has a list of President Trump's policy making. You can see where his heart lies. The most pro-life president that's ever existed, pro-economy. He's actually been helping a lot on criminal justice reform. I mean, you're right that the actions flow from the heart and the character, but that is a little bit different than the personality, which sometimes we get in our own way and present. And as Christians, I think it's important to note that we don't defend moral failure, right? We're not defending that, but that there is there a role to say among the elected officials we have, it's really a binary choice. There's really two choices here. If both have moral failings, we look to policy, right? And we look to the ramifications. I also wanted to just know what you were saying about our generation doesn't always do this type of analysis. And I think for me, and I would love to get y'all's input on this, millennials in recent memory, like the presidents we remember or old enough to remember are Presidents Bush and President Obama. The ultimate diplomats, the ultimate polished politicians. I mean, just they had, for better or worse about their policies, they were very distinguished gentlemen as a whole. Even President Bush was very diplomatic, though the media painted him in a negative light. But if you don't look too far back in history, there were President Nixons who had federal criminal issues at hand. And President Clinton impeached for moral failings in office. And President Kennedy, who is now like this renowned Democrat, he was having open affairs in office. And so it is very, very, very common to have political leaders who are immoral or have moral failings even in office. And I think our generation shies away from that because we haven't really dealt with that yet. Although I will say I can't speak to President Trump. He gaffes on Twitter. I don't know that he's had a mega moral failing in office. But Liberty, what do you have to say about anything we're discussing?
Well, I would like to touch on whether or not Christians have a moral duty to vote and for whom. I definitely think that Christians have a moral obligation to be civically engaged. And I think there is a danger we have to watch out for of reducing that to voting in a presidential election every 4 years. And so there's so much more to civic engagement than that. There are other elections. Obviously, you've talked about the Senate. There's congressional positions to vote for. There's state positions, which are very important in directing, the future of the nation. There's your city council, your school board, things you can get involved with even outside of elections in your community. So I would say, if you find yourself ever in a position where the two candidates that are presented to you for president or for another race really cause you to have qualms as far as like major moral objections, not just like, I don't really support everything about them or I don't really like them 100%, but like actually it would hurt my conscience based on my deeply held religious beliefs to vote for this person, then as a Christian, I don't think you have a moral obligation to vote in one election because at the end of the day, our citizenship is in heaven more than it's on earth. And so we also read in the Bible about Christian freedom. We have the gift of reason. The Holy Spirit convicts everybody differently. So we're going to reach different conclusions about who the right person is to vote for. And if you're at a point where you feel like I can't in good conscience vote for either person, I don't think you need to violate your principles because you think it's your Christian duty to do so, I think you can say, where else can I get engaged on the issues I do care about? Where can I actually get hands-on and make a difference in my community, in my state, in the nation, if I decide to sit this particular election out?
I think that's a really great point. I mean, there's a whole host of ways that Christians and the church as a whole already engage in our communities and serving others. I mean, top charitable contributions come from Christians as a denomination and Catholics both. But, you know, the Christian denomination as a whole, foster care is highly predominantly a Christian in faith. So that we do know in a lot of ways. But I think and this is a genuine question I have, is it is a binary choice unless you leave the top blank. And what are maybe like the ethical consequences, if any, of doing that? I mean, are there any ethical consequences to saying, okay, I'm going to set this one out, knowing that if you leave a vacuum, you know, in my mind, others will fill it. And so that's kind of where I genuinely wrestle with my many friends who have reached out to me and said what you're saying about having that moral check. But I mean, what would you say to that?
I would say, again, it comes down to really, like David was saying earlier, you got to wrestle with these issues. And if personally, you know, you are wrestling and thinking, you know, I'm not just choosing someone that I don't like their personality, but like I actually think on either side there's going to be damage done if I, you know, support this candidate. And so there's obviously, you know, we know, for instance, on the Democratic side, pro-abortion policies, things that would inhibit religious freedom, you know, a lot of big problems there, obviously. But I think what John Piper talks about in his article that you brought up, one of his quotes is, I think it's a drastic mistake to think that the deadly influences of a leader come only through his policies and not through his person. And so I know that is a debate, because in Al Mohler's article, which was really good, I really enjoyed it. I thought it gave a lot of food for thought. He talks about how, you know, it really is the policies that overshadow and like what actions are actually happening. And I think a lot of people are looking at certain policies of Trump's that they don't agree with, whether related to immigration or other things, but also at his rhetoric. And I think maybe they're giving more consequence to that than others. Because if you think of the president as the most powerful position in the world, basically, that's a huge platform that he has. And his words really do have an effect. I think politics are downstream from culture, but then people that are in those positions of power, they have a chance to normalize kind of the more negative aspects of our culture. So I think that's a concern.
Well, great points, Liberty. I just love your perspective on this, as do I hope our audience. Stay tuned, because more on this when we get back. We're going to talk about this issue. We might end the hour on Trump's voting record, but it depends how on track we stay here. So you can also watch us on Facebook or go to pointofview.net, read our articles. You can read up for yourself on any of the topics we've discussed today and more. So stay tuned and like us on Facebook. We'll see you soon.
(2020). It's been a pretty eventful year. We've experienced international tensions over the coronavirus and lockdowns, economic uncertainties, cities overrun by protests, rioting, and looters, and coming soon, a presidential election. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kirby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It is easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
Hi, I'm Chelsey Youman. I'm hosting your Millennial Roundtable today, where we are having a great discussion with different millennial perspectives about the moral obligation to vote, if any, how to engage in this election when we have failed character, maybe at the top of the ticket. It's a lot to discuss. It's a lot to unpack. And as voters who are Christians, we're all grappling with how do we order in terms of moral priority the issues we care about for the ballot and the party platforms, and how do we grapple with some of these issues? And I know, I'll start by saying I think most of us come from that place of desiring to be obedient to Scripture, from desiring to be faithful to that. But we still have to figure out what that looks like. And on one side of the equation, we have people like David Fraga, who we'll talk about later. I'm very irritated at him, but we'll get there. And John Piper, who are saying, look, morality in your political official is paramount. It's equal to, this is true. John Piper equated pride to abortion in terms of moral complicity. And then you have people on the other side like Eric Metaxas and Al Mohler, who are saying actually the moral consequences are much more dire for some of these policies and issues that we as a church have more of a duty to lean into and protect than caring as much and making so much of the character at the top of the ticket. So we've been discussing that debate. I'm going to talk a little bit about how I personally order the issues in terms of priority before us. So we've got all kinds of things. I'm going to leave the economy out of it because I think it's a little bit more difficult to make. It's not impossible, but it's not as clear the moral implications or moral directives from the Bible about the economy. So I'm going to leave that out of the equation. But things like abortion, marriage, foster care, immigration, criminal justice reform, those are all like what we could call more of the moral issues the Bible speaks to as humans and the human dignity God's given us. We are to treat one another. So when I'm looking at these from an ethical standpoint, my question is, which of these is most important because of the moral consequence of it going the wrong way is so much more horrific. So in terms of the moral consequence, all sin is the same. We talked about this earlier on the show. As an example, pride is as sinful as stealing, which is as sinful as murder, right? But the moral consequence of pride is destroyed relationships. The moral consequence of stealing is destroyed property. And the moral consequence of murder is a destroyed human. And so even the secular society, even our government officials, if they're non-Christians, have placed different grave consequences on those different actions. You get a different time in jail for petty theft than you do for murder. And that's for a reason, because to society it is more harmful. And so when I'm looking at my ticket, there is one issue that truly results in death, and not just one murder, but the death of 1 million unborn vulnerable children a year. And that is the abortion issue. So for me, that's going to take more priority. And then I go down from there on what else we have to look at. So when I'm looking at that helps inform me on how to vote. And really, do I have that sense of urgency that there's such an injustice and something that's so harmful to humans and God's heart that I have to engage and I have to be an activist based on that. How do you guys grapple with some of these issues?
I would say that as far as my own personal ordering of priorities, it's very similar. But again, I think, I think that doesn't mean that those are the only important issues out there. And so it's interesting to see where Christians kind of differ, and they may agree with these basic values, but what they think is not more important. I don't think abortion is that big of a deal, but what they think the consequence lies with those things. So, for instance, I think you can say you can vote in a presidential election for a candidate that has promoted more pro-life policies, and that's, a good thing. That's a valid choice. But if that's the extent of your pro-life activism, then that's not actually making the biggest impact possible. So you have to look at what is actually the biggest thing that makes a difference in lowering abortion rates. And so I know you mentioned David French, and you have some irritation with him. So I would like your opinion on this as well. But he had an article a few weeks ago saying, do pro-lifers who reject Trump have blood on their hands? And one of the points that he made is that if you're pro-life, the encouraging reality is that those things that matter most, your relationships and your local political community, are the things over which you have the most influence. And when he says matters most, I think he's talking about like actually matters most in lowering the abortion rate in the local community in which you live. And the things that matter the least is the presidency and national politics. And those are the things most removed from your daily life. So even if that is your biggest priority, is voting in the presidential election, like, yes, it's important, but is it the most important thing? And if you have other moral qualms with a certain candidate, does that mean that you have to vote for them?
Great questions. David, do you have anything you want to add?
Just in terms of decision making or things like that.
Yeah, anything.
I think it'd be good just to. I really love what you said, Liberty, right there. We do focus and get distracted on a lot of issues based on like surface level, right? Instead of going deeper. Something I always love to encourage just the people who I minister with and whatnot is that when we get a little fired up about like some issues here and there, I always say, okay, guys, like let's take a step back, right? And let's think about this. You know, what the world needs, we don't need more politicians, preachers, and things like that. What we need is deeper people. In other words, we need to be able to step into that invitation and go deeper to what the issue is, to look at the details, to have the conversations, and to make wise decisions, right? And then from that, how do we love people, you know, and loving God, and through the whole process, honoring God. And so in the decision-making process, I do always try to focus on the wrestling, honestly, like I said before. And it's so important. Like, are we playing God by making our own decisions and justifying ourselves? Because what my conscience may be speaking or thinking, or what might convict me, may not be so much, you know, what your conscience is kind of struggling with, right? And so maybe you could speak a little bit more on that, Chelsey.
Sure. So I think this is something that John Piper really hit in his article, which was this, a lot of it is philosophical, like what you're talking about is matters of conscience, but I do believe in inherent truth, and I do believe in like an absolute right and wrong. And because of that, I think I tend to focus more on the practical reality here instead of the ethereal, just because what John Piper said is led by his conscience, but it was really misguided biblically. I mean, he was saying, yes, all sin is the same, but no, pride is not killing more people or as many people as abortion. That's just not practically true. I can count the babies. Okay, so there's a practical reality here. The practical reality is there are two people. It's a pretty binary choice. I mean, there could be third party. You could leave the top blank, but there are real world consequences for our votes. There are real world tangible things that are going to occur or not occur. So let's take David French's article, because I think that's really important. But we'll talk a little now and then have a break and we'll get back to it. But I think my problem with David French is he chose specific facts. It was a conclusion in search of a rationale. He did not look at the whole picture. And I think if you look at all the facts, then you can make your assessment from there. But you have a duty, you have your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. And so David French's article he argued that the Supreme Court only takes like one abortion case every decade or so. That's a true fact. And that they're mostly a stabilizing force. So you can't really think about the Supreme Court when you're voting. And he also said in general that abortion rates, he cited a very common statistic Democrats are citing, that abortion rates have gone down under Democrat presidents historically. And so he's citing these facts, but they're not the whole picture. So the truth is, the reason it's so important to vote is because your state legislatures, which he did acknowledge this, will pass your pro-life legislation or fail to pass it. That is on your state legislatures. But the minute that legislation is passed, like the bills I'm working on, it goes directly to a federal court who is nominated, a judge who is nominated specifically by your president. And so liberal judges, when they nominate when liberal presidents nominate liberal judges to the court, they typically overturn pro-life legislation, and they have decades to do that because they're lifetime appointments, and the vice versa for the Republican. They'll uphold the pro-life legislation, hopefully. So it's your lower court that matters. So you can't just say, like, we only look at the Supreme Court. You have to say, wow, they get hundreds of circuit and lower court nominations, and those are going to have really tangible impacts and consequences on our pro-life legislation for years to come. And as soon as those bills are challenged, they're stayed for a few years. So you don't even really get to see the full effect of that pro-life legislation, sometimes for years. So I think those types of things are important to talk about, because you have to look at the whole picture. And then when we get back after the break, we can keep talking about David French and that article. But I know we're all grappling with these issues, and I obviously don't know everything, but I know that we're having such a great conversation, and I love your perspective. I love hearing about voting your conscience and making sure that you're prayerful and thoughtful and analytical when you go to the polls, if you choose to go to the polls. That's so important. And I know as Christians, we're all working from the same biblical understanding and just trying our best. And so I applaud everyone here and everyone who's listening as you guys debate and grapple with these issues. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this to finish the discussion.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Well, thank you for sticking with us. I'm Chelsey Youman, hosting the Millennial Roundtable, and we've had such a great, robust discussion. Right before the break, we were talking about grappling with the issues and really looking under the hood of the car and figuring out all of the facts, a holistic picture of the facts instead of just isolating them as we're going to the polls and voting. Liberty, I wanted to make sure that you had a chance to follow up after our discussion because you were mentioning David French over the break and some of his articles. Was there anything you wanted to add?
I think, so you talked about how you can have your own opinion and you can't have your own facts. And so I really did appreciate your response to the importance of, the state legislation and pro-life laws, but also the importance of federal judges and upholding those. That was really informative. So I appreciate that perspective. And I think I would come back and say, in addition to the pro-life issue, maybe speaking for people who have a hard time or some moral qualms with supporting President Trump, it's another fact that America is extremely divided right now. Mm-hmm. There was, I think in 2019, a paper released called Lethal Mass Partisanship, where they talked about like over 42% of Democrats and Republicans view their political opponents as downright evil. Nearly 1 in 5 members of each party said their political opponents lacked traits considered to be fully human. Significant portion said that violence would be justified if the other party won the 2020 election. 20% of Democrats and 16% of Republicans admitted to sometimes thinking we'd be better off as a country if the large numbers of the opposing party just died. So I think that's a very dangerous state that we're in, and we've seen it in our society like this year, like how divisive we can be over whether or not to wear masks, or like these, riots that we're seeing that are extremely destructive, and, there's loss of human life there. So one thing you have to look at is, again, I go back to what I talked about earlier with the platform that the president has, is the power that his words have. And like, we talked about the heart and how our actions flow out of that, but the Bible also says that the power of life and death is in the tongue. Mm-hmm. So I think that we can't just say, oh, the president's tweets or what he says, like ignore that and focus on his policies. I think you have to take seriously what he says and the implications, that has. And so if he, he's not to blame for the divisiveness of our time. I believe that largely politics are downstream of culture, but he does have that platform to say, how is he going to affect this? And I think that unfortunately, more often than not, he tends to exacerbate the issue and kind of play into that partisanship and that divisiveness. And I think that has real implications, especially for a lot of people. An interesting thing Pew had out a few months ago was that as far as Christians go, the only group of Christians that favors Trump over Biden is white Christians. So that's not to say, in what you should vote one way or the other. It's just to say that there's not uniformity even among Christians, the church as a whole, on what the most important issue is. And I think you have to say, even if you don't agree with that conclusion of, voting for Biden, say, okay, what is going on here with our Christian, brothers and sisters, to where they're really feeling like there is, some dire consequences to what the president is doing and what he's saying, and how that's like affecting our divisiveness and who that's hurting.
Right. I think, man, you just bring the truth, liberty, and such great points and perspective to this discussion. I love hearing your perspective, like the whole picture, and looking at, the consequences of this type of rhetoric and the divisiveness in our country. I mean, I think what I'm hearing, I think, from you is this idea that we still have a duty to engage one way or another. So regardless of the voting, and we did talk about this earlier on the show in the first hour for those of you listening who want to go back and hear about this. But as you mentioned, the law and politics is downstream of culture. And for me, the church has a duty to engage with that culture, but there's already institutions in place for that engagement, like it or not. Politics, the media, Hollywood, your church, your neighborhood. I mean, those are the arenas we have to engage with culture on discipleship and on the gospel. And I think we would see laws we liked and candidates we liked if the church wasn't continuing to engage and spread the gospel, but even on issues that are divisive. Because I think for me, a lot of the issues I care about, I mean, they're rooted in scripture. I mean, we know that God created us man and woman, and that is good. And if we perpetuated truth from the loving place of scripture, I think the rest of the world would look a little bit different. But that requires the church to engage. And I think sometimes the danger in reading, for me, these arguments on the side of John Piper or David French, who are saying we got to set this one out. We're in the world, but not of it, is that's a failure to engage. And I think on all fronts, for me, even in the political realm, there's a place for the gospel and truth and light. And when it comes to President Trump's, you're mentioning we're divided as a country, and his rhetoric continues, I think, to expand that divide. I almost wonder if we were already divided. And we as millennials, I mean, I've said this. I've asked so many people in the generations older than me. I said, I hear constantly, this is the most divided we've ever been, most divided we've ever been. And it feels like they say that every election. So I've been asking, are we really more divided than we've ever been? And they are saying yes. They are saying in decades and decades of politics, it is worse now. We are on polar opposite sides. But I don't think it's the result of rhetoric. I'm sorry. I think it's the result of genuine philosophical and ideological differences, and the debate has become base. And for one side, it is their religion. I mean, their hope is in the government and the outcomes, and for we as Christians, our hope is not in the government and outcomes. And when you pit kind of the real, we've talked on the show in the second hour about some of these real party platform differences and philosophical differences. I mean, I think the divide is already there. It's just more poignant when you have someone who's pointing it out the way that Trump does. David, I would love to hear from you in the last couple of minutes on your thought for how we finish this out.
Yeah, I think it's really important to engage to a certain extent, right? I was talking earlier about stewardship. Stewardship is very important as a believer, right? We talk about living in excellence. Excellence is being present in the moment, and it's stewarding well what is in front of you, not forecasting, not living what's ahead, not living on what has passed, yet remembering that, but living in what's in front of you. In other words, it's the manna that God gives us today. And so not perfection. Perfection is something we can never achieve. That's why we need Jesus. That's why we need a Savior, right? All that being said, I think we tend to fall into linear thinking very, very easily, which is like the A plus B will result in C. The thing is, in our world, that C never comes out the way we expect it. Therefore, we put in a lot of expectations, even if we come from an unbiased perspective, even if we try to do things to the best of our abilities, the outcomes are never what we expect. And so something I always say, and I want to encourage the listeners, that if it doesn't start with God, it will always end in disappointment. And so what I do believe during this time is I want to encourage you guys to be like, hey, are we living in a double standard mindset? Are we trying to, is that perspective that we're bringing in a double standard mindset? And with that, where do we need to extend grace? Because we need grace ourselves.
That's a great point. That's a great point. Liberty, is there anything and final thoughts before we round out the hour that you want to draw our attention to?
Yeah, I would just say that I totally agree with you that our hope is not in government. And I think that is a big reason for the divide. A lot of people put their hope in government. But at the same time, I would say if our hope isn't in government, then that doesn't mean that we're necessarily obligated to vote one way or the other. I do, again, believe that we are required to be civically engaged, like you said. But an interesting article that Tim Keller had in the New York Times a couple of years ago talks about how Christians, we really shouldn't fit in perfectly with either party platform. So that's something to think about as well. It's just like if you completely agree with one or the other, then maybe you're not engaging the way you should, because there should always be a little dissonance there.
Right, absolutely. Well, we are rounding out this hour. Thank you guys so much for talking about this with me today. Some great topics. You can go to pointofview.net and read these articles. You can also read about President Trump's record. If you are a Christian wondering what has he actually done, you can go to Faith and Freedom Coalition, FRC. Thank you, David Fraga and Liberty, for being with us. And I just hope we get to talk to you guys soon after the election.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program